Alright, this is Mr. McSwain, and this is another Packet Tracer video, and on this video I'm going to be showing y'all how to configure a switch. Alright, now, if you need to get more familiar with the icons, please feel free to watch the previous video where I actually do a Packet Tracer walkthrough. Make sure you watch that one in order to get an idea of the icons, because I'm not going to recap all of that. We're just going to go straight into the work, okay? So for this one, what we're going to do is we're going to go into Network Devices, and we're going to go to Switches, and we're going to pull a 2960 out onto the screen. And then we're going to go over to End Devices, and we're going to grab a PC. Now, for the configuration method I like to use, I'm also going to grab a laptop. Alright, so now, first things first, let's cable the devices. Okay, so we're going to go to a copper straight through cable. We are going to go from the fast Ethernet port on the PC up to, and we'll go with fast Ethernet 01 for the switch. Now, if you notice, the communication is starting to connect even though nothing has been configured on these devices. This is because remember that a switch is a layer 2 device. Layer 2 devices only function with the MAC address of any kind of NIC, and so therefore as long as it has a functioning NIC with a MAC address, communication will take place. However, we are going to be giving the information of layer 3 configurations onto these devices. Okay, now first things first, we're going to go into the PC. What we're going to do is we're going to left click on it one time. That's going to open up the window. We then go to desktop, and we're going to go to this first icon at the far left to call it IP configuration. Now, underneath IP configuration, you'll notice that it's already set to static. We are not setting up any kind of a router or anything that provides a DHCP service, so we are going to have to stick with a default static IP address that we come up with. For this one, let's just go ahead and call it 192.168.1. Let's go 15. Okay. Now, when we click the next block, you'll notice that it automatically gives us the standard Class C subnet. That is because the first number here is a 192, which tells us it's a Class C, which gives us a 255.255.255.0 subnet. In order to learn more about subnets, please watch one of my other videos as far as how subnetting works in order to understand more about what this subnet means. Now, for this configuration, we're not going to set a default gateway because we don't have a default gateway to set up as of right now, because we're not setting up a router in this video. Alright, now that we have done that, the PC is configured. We'll click the X in the blue. I always suggest going back one more time just to make sure the settings stuck. They did, so we'll click the blue X again, and we will click out of the PC. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, there's two ways to configure the switch. One is you can configure the switch by left clicking one time on the switch and then going to the CLI interface that is built into the switch. This is a perfectly acceptable way of configuring the switch. However, this does not work in real life. You cannot interact with the CLI of an intermediary device directly. You have to console into it. Now, in order to console in it, I like to use a laptop because in most cases the switch itself is not near the PC that we can configure it with, and we have to have what I like to call a configuration laptop handy that has a COM port built into it. Alright, why do we need a COM port? Because a console cable, which is down here, the baby blue color, requires to be plugged into the RS-232 port. This is a COM port. If you've never seen a COM port before, it looks similar to an old school VGA monitor cable. However, instead of 15 pins, it only has 9. So we're going to click on the RS-232 port on the PC, and then we're going to come over here to the switch, and we are going to click on the console port. Once that connection is made, we're going to go into the laptop. We're then going to go to desktop, and we are going to go to terminal. Now, as I mentioned before, the terminal is the only method inside of Packet Tracer that allows us to do configurations. We click on terminal, we connect with using the default baud rate, we hit OK. Now, in the real world, I'd suggest either using TeraTerm or PuTTY in order to be able to configure a router or a switch. Alright, so we're going to scroll down a little bit, or we can just hit the enter key, and this is going to take us into the user exec mode. Now, the user exec mode, and I'm going to type that out there, user exec mode is the equivalent of view only. Okay, this means that we can look at some configurations, but we cannot make changes to them. In order to elevate our privileges, we need to type the command enable. Alright. Alright, by typing that command, you'll notice that it now went from having a greater than symbol to having a hashtag. Now this hashtag puts us into privileged exec mode. Now, privileged exec mode basically is the same as saying admin mode. Alright, so in this level, we can actually do configurations to the switch itself. So let's go ahead and get started by doing that. Now, if you'll notice that whenever we first logged into the switch, there was nothing prompting us for anything. We just went directly into admin mode by typing the command enable. The first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to fix that. Okay, now in order to fix that, what we're going to do is we're going to go into the command configure terminal, because I didn't mention, but whenever you first get into privileged exec mode, you're in an administrative mode. However, all configuration that is done at this base level will affect the unit at the root level. By typing configure terminal, we are actually going into making changes to the system as a whole, not individual ports yet. However, these are going to be changes that affect everything. Alright, I'll give you an example before we get into the security measures. Let's just go ahead and change the host name first. So in order to change the host name, we're going to type the command hostname. Now remember, with a switch or a router, that everything that you enter into the system is a command followed by an argument. Okay, now the command is telling the system what you want to do. The argument is giving it the details of it. So in this one, I'm going to say host name, and then I want to change it from being switch to, I'm going to call it SW for switch 1, and then an underscore BLD1 to say that it is a building 1, and then FL1 to say that it is on the first floor. Now, when you're giving something a description, remember that this is what an individual is going to see when they log into the switch. So if I hit enter here, notice that the name has changed. Now, this is a very strong identifier. This tells me exactly where this switch is at. But then again, it also tells anyone else who's attached to the switch where it is at. Okay, so just be aware of that whenever you're giving something descriptions and you're giving something identifiers, that you don't want to be too upfront with where something is, because you don't want the wrong person knowing where devices are located. All right. Now, what I want you to notice at this point is that I made the change here, and that change has stuck. However, you notice that it does not change out here. Now, I want to let you know that the way I looked and the way I view this is that think about this label that's outside here as being like a sticky label on the outside of the switch. When you left click on this slowly, you're going to notice that you can change it, and you could say SW1 underscore BLD1 underscore FL1 to match the name that you're going to give it, as Packet Tracer can be used as your documentation. However, that is not going to make the change in the switch itself. This is merely as if I have stuck a sticky label to the front of the switch. Okay, so just remember that whenever you're doing configurations. Alright, now back into the nitty gritty. Again, whenever we got into the system, we noticed that we were in user exec mode, and all we had to do was type the enable command, and we were immediately in privileged exec mode. We don't want that. What we want to do is add a little bit of security into it. So in order to do that, at the configure terminal level, we're going to say that when the enable command is typed, we want to prompt for the secret password, which basically is, now remember that secret and password at this place means the exact same thing. However, secret will automatically apply a strong encryption to this password. So no matter what we use, it will be encrypted. So I'm going to use the password as Cisco to keep it very basic. Okay, so we are going to say at the enable prompt for the secret password of Cisco. Okay, now if I hit enter and I type end to go back to the parent level, and then I exit one more time, I'm now back at the parent level of the switch as if we had just connected to it. So okay, y'all, let's see what happens. I hit enter. Notice how the name is still the one name that I gave it, and we are at the user exec mode. Nothing has changed as far as us getting in yet. Okay, so now I'm going to type enable to go into the privileged exec, and whenever I hit enter, I am prompted for the password we've just asked for. Okay, now as I'm typing Cisco, notice the cursor does not move. You will not get asterisks, you will not get any notification of any letters that you have typed. So if you're typing the password and you're like, oh, did I type it right or not? Then what my suggestion is, hit enter, let it fail, and then type it again. Okay, don't try to backspace or guess what you've typed. Okay. All right, the next thing we're going to do is now we're going to go back into configure terminal. And at this level, now we're going to go into some more stuff. Okay, first thing I want to do now that I'm back in here is I want to say no IP domain hyphen lookup. Now, why would I say this? This command is actually an interesting one that I like. I think it's kind of cool. That the concept is that basically what's going to happen is that if you type something wrong, your switch is going to try to do you the favor of figuring out what you meant to type. This process can actually take it about a good 2 to 5 minutes to try to finally just fail out and say, okay, I get it, you typed something wrong. By typing this command that says no IP domain lookup, we've actually told the switch, don't try to be Google. Don't try to figure out what I meant to say. Just tell me I'm wrong so we can move on to the next error or the next, command. Hopefully it's not an error the second time. But that's what this basically does. No IP domain lookup tells the switch that we don't want it to attempt to guess what we meant to say. Alright, so now we're going to continue with a little bit of our security measures, because remember how I said that whenever we first got into the switch, we were immediately in the view only user exec mode. We don't want that. We want that if somebody comes into this switch, that they're going to be prompted for passwords out the wazoo. So we're going to want to keep, so for the purposes of this tutorial, we're going to keep them kind of easy, because we want to pick something that we can actually find pretty easy or remember. But in real life, you're going to want to make this to be something that is actually going to be pretty difficult for somebody to guess or figure out. So what we want to do now is we're going to take this and we're going to configure the line console 0. Now, you're going to be asking, what is line console 0? Well, line console 0 is the actual physical plug that we're using right now to connect into this switch. So if I left click on this switch and actually bring it up and go to the physical, you'll notice that in the back of the switch there is this one console port that's sitting back there. That is the console port that we are physically plugged into. This command is actually going to configure what happens if somebody is plugged into this port. Okay, so now you may be asking yourselves, well, why is it called 0? Why is it not called 1 since it's the only one back there? Well, that is because whenever we're dealing with anything as far as networking is concerned, 0 is a usable number. You don't start counting by 1, you start counting with 0. Okay, so line con 0 just means that it is the first port that is on the back. It's actually the only port, but it's still the first one. If there were multiples, they would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Now, notice that the configuration now says config line. Config line means that we are configuring a line. Whether that line is physical or virtual, we are now doing a configuration. So what we're wanting to do now is we are going to want to ask for a password. We're going to put a password on that port. We're going to again call it Cisco because, like I said, we want to keep it simple. So this is the command, this is the argument. Now, when typing password, remember this: everything after that space that I have highlighted is now part of the password. So if you accidentally hit a space right there, there is now a space in that password. Okay, so be very careful with what you type as far as the devices and the configurations, okay? So anything after the space is going to be part of the argument. Just remember that. All right, so I'm going to hit enter. Now, the good news is we've now given that port a password. Bad news is we haven't prompted for it yet. So we have to type the command login. What the command login does is it actually now prompts for the password if somebody goes into this system. So I'm going to hit login. Now, You'll notice that at some places I'm typing the command exit and in other places I'm typing the command end. Well, there's a difference between the two. If I type end at this point, notice how I will immediately jump back to the root level, back to the actual privileged exec level. And then I can type exit. If you type exit in any level, you will only go back to the previous level. So just remember that, okay? End takes us back all the way to the beginning. Exit one level. All right, so now I'm back to the beginning as if I had just hooked into the switch. So let's go ahead and hit enter and see what happens. Now we're prompted for a password. All right, so we type in Cisco. Now we're back at the view only user exec mode. We type enable. And then we type Cisco again. And now we're back in privileged exec. All right, we go config T. Because now I will tell y'all there are shorthands for some of these commands. But I always recommend learn what the command actually is before you start getting familiar with the shorthands, because if a shorthand command ever changes, then the one you know becomes useless. Now some of them will never change, like configure terminal will never change, show running config will never change, copy running config to startup config will never change. So the shorthands on those are pretty good. They're pretty handy. All right. So I'm now back at configure terminal. So now I'm going to configure the other line, because you may be saying to yourself, well, you know, hey, what if I don't want to connect to it physically? What if I want to be able to access it remotely from somewhere else on the network? Well, there actually are 16 virtual lines that will allow you to connect into a switch. Now, those lines are labeled 0 through 15, again, with 0 being the first number and 15 being the actual 16th port. Okay, now by doing 0 space 15, we're actually going to be configuring all 16 ports at one time. Again, we're going to do the same thing we did with our physical port, and we're going to say password Cisco. Then we're going to hit enter on that, and we're going to prompt for a login. Now, with the virtual lines, they're not going to be capable of being used until after we configure a VLAN. Okay, so now we're going to do that here in just a minute, but not at this current moment in time, because yes, these are the connections that if you have a terminal connection, TerraTerm or any other method of actually making a network-based terminal connection, there has to be a layer 3 IP address assigned to the switch in order for you to be able to remote into it. This is just placing a password on the actual lines, the actual connections, okay? So, now, we're going to exit back. I'm going to go end and come back to the parent level, because right now I want to type show run, which means show running config. Because what I want you to see is notice here, we've changed the host name. Right here we have said enable the secret, and here is our encrypted password. Okay, now, but if I hit the space bar in order to show a page at the time, and I scroll down, notice how at the end down here where you see your linecon 0 and your VTY lines, notice how we can see the password. That is because the secret command only applies to that first section. Okay, in order to put an encryption on the rest of our passwords, we actually have to interact and enact a service. So to enact that service, we're going to go back into config T, and we're going to type the command service password hyphen encryption. Now, one thing I want to show you here is, yes, I could type out the full word encryption, but then again, I'll be honest, I don't know how to spell it. So I can actually ask Cisco, hey, have I typed enough of this command that you actually know what I mean so I don't have to try to spell it out? And if I hit the tab key and that's the case, then yes, it does. And as you can see, it types out the full command in order for me to turn on that service. Now, so if I hit enter, then now I can hit end, show run, and now I scroll down a page at a time, and you notice that there is an encryption placed on the password. All right, good stuff. Okay, so now we're going to keep on moving on. So now we've configured a login on our VTY ports, and we've configured a login on our primary connection. So now let's go ahead, as far as our security is concerned, let's go ahead and just tell people that you cannot get into this switch. So we go back into configure terminal, and now what we're going to do is we're going to say banner message of the day, MOTD, message of the day. Now, with the message of the day, you have to have a starting character and an ending character. Okay, the starting character, I always recommend use the hashtag, because there's not going to be any time that character is probably actually going to appear in your setup. So like if you were to use a capital C or something like that as your starting character, which it could be anything, if that character is in the banner at any point in time, that is where the banner will stop. Okay, so we're going to say hashtag, and I'm going to say do not access this device without permission. Exclamation point. Another hashtag to end it. Alright, so now, what did that do? Again, let's go end, and then we'll hit exit, and let's take a look. So now, I have just plugged into the switch, or I have just remoted into it, either with a virtual connection or with a physical connection. I have just connected. Okay, so I'm going to hit enter, and there we go. Do not access this device without permission, and we get prompted for the first password. Okay, so now we've got basic security established onto our switch to where it doesn't have the easy access that it does whenever it comes with the defaults. So we're going to do Cisco, enable, and then Cisco again. Excuse me. So now we're getting into some of the other configurations. So the first thing that we're wanting to get into on this one is we're going to go back into configure terminal, and what I want to do is in the next video I'm going to create, we're actually going to add a router to the setup, and we're going to give it an IP address to associate and become the default gateway. Now, when you initially set up a switch, and like I said, a switch is always considered, so I'm going to say this in here, switch equals layer 2 device, only MAC address. Now, what that means is that the switch itself only cares about the MAC address. It does not care about an IP address. An IP address is a layer 3 communication method. It is a logical communication. Now, but that doesn't mean that our VLANs and all of our devices that are connected to the switch don't have. Remember, we've actually configured the PC to have an IP address. So, if we want to communicate with an IP address, the switch needs to know who to send that traffic to. This is why we have to tell the switch what the default gateway is, or where to send all of the layer 3 traffic. So, sorry, that should be IP default hyphen gateway. Now, at this point, I will tell you that the address we would give to the default gateway is going to be 192.168.1.1. Now, it does not exist yet. This is true. However, when we configure a router, that is going to be the IP address I give it. At your house, you would want to do an IP config on your desktop or whatever is connected to your ISP router in order to see what the default gateway IP address is on the internal side. For this, we have not created one yet. So, with the IP default gateway set to 192.168.1.1. Now, note that this is the only time that you will enter in a configuration of an IP address that you will not have to include the subnet mask, because you are merely pointing the information to a specific IP address. So we're going to hit enter on that, and that is going to point the switch to the default gateway once it is established. Alright, now after this, one of the last things we're going to do is we want to configure the VLAN. Now, why would we configure a VLAN? Well, the VLAN, its main purpose is allowing for physical segmentation. This is where we can establish ports to communicate with other ports on a physical level. In other words, the segmentation would be separating the switch, and you would have to actually physically move the cable from one port to another in order for that communication to take place. So the other reason we have a VLAN is because we want to allow for remote configuration. So this is going to be the point in time where we're actually going to give the switch an IP address, a layer 3 address. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to type interface VLAN 1. All right, now you can have as many VLANs as you want to establish, but realize that by default all ports are in VLAN 1. So by configuring VLAN 1, we're actually configuring a way to control all the ports of the switch. So now notice that our configuration command now turned from config to config IF, which is different from config line. This means that we are configuring an interface. VLAN is an interface. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we want to give it an IP address. So we're going to say IP address space 192.168.1, and we'll just call this 100, and we're going to hit the space, and because it is a 192 address, we're going to go with the default class C subnet. All right, we're going to hit enter on that, and we now have an IP address associated to the VLAN. This is now going to be the IP address that not only we can ping to make sure that it is up, but this is also going to be the IP address that we will use in our terminal connection in order to remote into the switch. Now, I do like to say this, that I have a recommendation that I make to everybody, and I like to say that if you can give it an IP address, give it a description. Now, a description is similar to the banner message of the day, except the description should be telling you what that port is configured for. So in other words, what we're wanting to say here is the description for this is switch 1 VLAN 1. Okay, that's it. We're just saying that this is the VLAN of switch 1. All right, we're going to hit enter on that. Now, one last thing to remember on a VLAN. Now, by default, all ports on a switch are on. So in other words, if I come out here outside of our configuration window and I pull the cable from this PC and then I plug it in and I go to say port 2, notice the communication still starts to establish. That is because all of the ports are on. Now, by default, a VLAN is not. So while we are still in the VLAN, so uno momento, I'm going to blank that out, hit enter so that I can see that we're still in the configuration of the interface. Notice how this is basically a dialog box that tells me, or tells you and me, that we just switched from port 1 to port 2. So it went to down on port 1 and went to up on port 2. Alright, so now we're still inside of the VLAN 1. So what we want to do inside of VLAN 1 is we want to turn it on. Now, Cisco devices and intermediary devices do not understand the concept of on and off, okay? They don't. They only know one concept, and that one concept that they're aware of is the word shutdown, which means to turn it off, okay? So, in order to do the opposite of any command on a Cisco switch or router, all you have to do is put the word no in front of it. So in other words, if we say no shutdown, that's going to be the same as turning it on. So we're going to hit enter. And notice that the VLAN state is now up. All right. Now, one last thing while we're in the interfaces that I want to show you is that if I were to go into interface FA, which stands for Fast Ethernet, on the initial switch in port 1, and I were to hit enter, I just jumped from the VLAN interface into the interface of FA01. But what I want you to notice is that nothing here changed. So I have no inclination at this point where I'm at, except for the fact of knowing that I just jumped there. My recommendation for this is that as soon as you get done configuring a port or figuring any type of interface, type the exit command, and then that will take you back down one level, and then now you can type interface FA0/1, and now you know for a solid fact where you are. It's no configure, it's not a guessing game. Now, so inside the interfaces of a switch, there's not really much you can do with them. You can place them into a VLAN, but we're not going to go into that stage at this point in time for this video. We're going to keep it very simplistic. So at a simplistic level, the main thing we would want to talk about is that, like I said, all ports on a switch by default are on. So that's a huge security risk as far as physical security. We don't want to do that. So what I want to do is I would like to shut down every port that I'm not using. Okay, so now we know that we moved from interface 1 to interface 2 with our switch, with our PC, but let's say we don't want to do that. So what we're going to want to do is I'm going to exit out, because now I want to shut down every port except for port 1. But now watch what's going to happen with our PC over here, because I haven't moved it yet. So you can get into any interface individually by stating the interface and then the name of the interface. However, what I can do is I can say interface range FA0/2 hyphen 15 or 24, because this is a 24 port switch. Now, if I hit enter here, notice how it went from saying config if to now it says config if range. Now I know I'm configuring a group of ports. Okay, so what would I want to do? Shut them bad boys down. Now, what this is going to do is this is going to allow us for physical security. Now, notice that it has told me that it is now administratively down. That means it's not just down because there's nothing plugged into it. It's down because I've told it to be down. So now, notice how we've got a red triangle on our cable. So what I've got to do is I know that I did not shut down port 1. So if I plug it back into port 1, we're back up and going. Alright. So now, with that being said, we've configured the ports, we've configured the VLAN, we've got everything secured, we've added banners, we've added passwords, and we've got this switch ready to go. Alright, now, with that being said, the switch is 100% ready to go. We are super happy, so we can hit end and we are good to go and we can walk away. No. Because if we walk away at this current moment in time, if password is ever lost to that switch, all of our configuration changes are lost. And that is because we are in the running config, not the startup config. The running config is written in RAM. So since the running config is written in RAM, it is wiped when power is lost. Now, in order to override what is in the startup config with the configuration we just got done typing, we now need to run the command copy run start. Now notice I am doing this at the root level. This is one of the only commands you'll really ever do at this level. There are others, but again, we're keeping this simple. So what this is saying is copy the running config on top of the startup config. I hit enter. It prompts me if I want to do that. I hit enter again, and we are now good to go. All right. Now, with that being said, we have actually configured this switch. It's 100% ready to go. I hope you have found this video both informative and entertaining, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.